everybody. I'm Ajit K. Mishra, your course instructor for Literature and Coping Skills. I'm here again with another lecture on the segment that we are currently doing. The segment is on negotiating trauma. In my last two lectures, I talked about how it's very important for each one of us to know what trauma is all about, so that we can negotiate our traumatic experiences well and ensure our return to our life and our subjective well-being. So today I'm going to talk about a very different kind of trauma, and then I'll walk you through the idea of Maya Angelou's Still I Rise, and then towards the end of this lecture I'll tell you how Maya Angelou's speaker is able to cope with the disasters, the traumatic experiences that she had. So let's take a look at each of those elements. So in this lecture, as I have just told you all, that I'm going to talk about Maya Angelou's Still I Rise. But before I do so, I'll walk you through the idea of a different kind of trauma. So let's take a look at that. But before I again take you to that different kind of trauma, let me tell you that I'm going to talk about a very different ये थोड़ा गलत हो गया, छोड़ दीजिए इसको, मैं कर लूँ, आप वो दो बार हो गया सेम चीज़, शुरू कर दूंगा मैं फिर से, ठीक है? Start. Hello everybody, I'm Ajit K. Mishra, your course instructor for Literature and Coping Skills. I'm here again with another lecture on this module, that is negotiating trauma. In my last two lectures, I talked about how trauma affects our existence, our well-being severely, and how we all need to be aware of its devastating properties so that we can take care of it, so that we can negotiate with it to return to life and negotiate our subjective well-being as well. Today I'm going to walk you through the idea of racial and historical trauma with the help of Maya Angelou's Still I Rise, and I'm also going to show you how the speaker in that poetic composition finally helps us develop certain skills and certain coping strategies for instances of racial or historical trauma. So let's take a look at those elements. So racial trauma is a very different kind of trauma. Interestingly enough, the world was not awake to this particular kind of trauma. It's only towards the end of the 90s and at the beginning of the century, the new century, that researchers directed their focus towards this particular problem. So until that point, people used to look at racial trauma from the perspective of historical trauma, but there was a need to separate racial trauma from historical trauma, which is in fact far more inclusive than this one, and which in fact makes it impossible for researchers to focus on this particular aspect of trauma. So racial trauma is in fact very closely associated with the idea of race, which is a socially constructed concept. We all know that, and it was in fact created to underpin the rational, the logic, that enslavement is necessary. Enslavement of the persons of African descent is necessary, and then it was necessary because of the Atlantic slave trade. So that particular rationale escapes our reasoning on any given day, but that was in place for a long time, and that was the beginning of this particular type of trauma. So the invention of race, it was in fact an invention, it's an ideological invention, and the historical chain of dehumanizing and traumatic events that continue to hinder human progress is something that we all need to direct our attentions towards. So this has turned out to be a vicious cycle. So And this the creation of this human hierarchy in which the whites are privileged, the people with different skin colors are not that privileged. And this hierarchy is of course now a lived socio-political reality and continues to haunt us, continues to disturb us, cause a lot of distress to us, and continues to give us severe psychological problems all through. So it happens to all those people of color except the whites who are privileged. So this is exactly the idea to which we can direct our attention towards, so that we can locate the beginning of historical or racial trauma. So the trauma of racism refers to the cumulative negative impact of racial practices on the lives of people of color, as I told you, encompassing the emotional, psychological, health, social and economic effects of multi-generational and historical trauma. Trauma of racism relates to the damaging effects of the ongoing societal and intra-social group racial microaggressions, internalized racism, overt racist experiences, discrimination and oppression within the lives of the people of color. So it is all pervasive. It has been historically pervasive. In fact, it has entered all aspects of our existence. So if somebody is a person of color, then the person is or has been subjected to such traumatic experiences. So racial trauma is everywhere. It is all pervasive. Hugh Butts was the first to draw our attention to what we now call racial trauma. That's the reason why I told you that at the turn of this century, researchers in fact directed their attention towards this particular aspect of trauma, racial trauma, so, and race-based trauma, and the impact of such traumatic experiences in mental health literature. Until that point, people used to approach race-based trauma through the lens of historical trauma only. Racial trauma or race-based trauma, as I have already told you all that, it's a physical, psychological symptoms that black, indigenous and people of color experience after exposure to particularly distressing, life-threatening, racist experiences. The only difference between the other kind of trauma and this particular kind of specific trauma, that is race-based trauma, is this. So one needs to be exposed to racist experiences in order to experience racist or racial trauma. So these traumatic experiences can be real or perceived. So it can be directly experienced or it can also be witnessed. You may not be the victim, but you may witness a traumatic experience being experienced by somebody else, a person of color. So it can be interpersonal or systemic. In most cases, it is systemic than interpersonal. So the effects of racial trauma actually passes down within communities and across generations. Now that's one of the most important aspects of racial trauma, that it is not restricted to one particular generation only. It becomes intergenerational. Therefore it derives historical properties. It turns out to be historical trauma, and that in fact requires that we focus on this particular aspect of racial trauma. So that brings us to the idea of historical trauma. Historical trauma is otherwise called soul wound, in which the soul is wounded over a period of time, over decades, over centuries. So the soul is rendered permanently wounded, and that makes it very, very difficult for persons who experience historical trauma to cope with this particular kind of traumatic experience. So it's a form of multi-generational trauma, because it passes from one generation to the other, and then generation after generation experiences this particular kind of trauma. And this is experienced by a specific cultural, racial or ethnic group. It can be the blacks, it can be the browns, it can be the Hispanics. So people of a specific culture, racial or ethnic group actually experience such kind of trauma. These experiences, which are shared by communities, actually result in cumulative emotional and psychological wounds that are carried across generations. So these experiences, these painful experiences, get accumulated over a certain period of time, and then when it is passed to the next generation, it leaves a severe impact on the psyche of that, or the psychological shaping of that particular generation, even if that generation has not experienced similar traumatic events or have not been exposed to similar traumatic events, they still experience the same pain and suffering. Historical trauma has certain symptoms that starts with low self-esteem, because you are historically excluded. You do not have a history. Even if you have a history, it is so miniature, it's so ignoble that you do not want to identify with your history. So you are denied a history, and the only history that you have is a history of pain and suffering, is a history of oppression. So that leads to low self-esteem and depression, self-destructive behavior including suicide, marked propensity for violent or aggressive behavior, because that is how you vent your anger and frustration, and then substance misuse and addiction, because you would like to forget the pangs of historical trauma. And then finally, high rates of suicide and cardiovascular disease. So in a way, this particular kind of trauma has both physiological and psychological impacts. Therefore, this is a very, very important type of trauma towards which we all need to direct our attentions. And then this particular interesting thing is also generally associated with historical trauma, but this is a very, very new concept. This epigenetic studies being conducted by Rachel Yehuda and Chris Mason establish the fact that epigenesis plays a very, very important role in the passing of these traumatic experiences from one generation to the other generation. So one generation that is exposed to traumatic events or experiences will definitely pass the traces, the residues of that particular experience to the next generations, and the genetic framework coding of that particular generation will be altered because of the experiences of this particular generation. So although Yehuda and Mason are very, very cautious while saying that there is no need to jump into any conclusion right now, but their preliminary researchers have established the fact that epigenesis plays an important role in the passing of traumatic experiences from one generation to the other. So that brings us to the question of racial trauma and its related symptoms. So if we take a look at the symptoms that people experiencing racial trauma in fact go through will find a lot of similarities between racial trauma and PTSD. So distress, disturbing images, thoughts, numbing are some of the experiences that you experience if you are experiencing racial trauma. Avoidance, you try to avoid people who remind you of those traumatic experiences. There are occasions when people even avoid themselves. They get depersonalized, or they experience derealization as well. So that leads to intense anxiety or depression relating to that particular traumatic event. So anxiety and depression are also the symptoms of racial trauma. And then people who experience racial trauma are severely distracted by memories or thoughts of that particular trauma. So they cannot concentrate, they live on the edge, which is very, very similar to that of those people who experience either acute stress disorder or PTSD. And then negative thoughts about self. People begin to blame themselves by saying they are indeed the ones who do not deserve to exist on this earth. Since they are born with a different skin color, they do not deserve to be a part of this world. So self-blaming, self-hatred, and negative thoughts about the self, and even about people around you are very, very common in this kind of trauma. And then finally, increased sensitivity and reactivity. So since you begin to experience that startle thing, you become extremely reactive or sensitive towards things. You easily lose your cool, you become aggressive, angry, frustrated. There are people who begin to cry, sob, wail, and they also become extremely reactive to the revisiting, even rethinking of such traumatic experiences. And then finally, dissociation also sets in, and it results in depersonalization, in which you are completely dissociated from yourself, and then derealization, in which you find everything around you to be unreal. So dissociation is also a major symptom of racial trauma. So with that in mind, I can now walk you through Still I Rise, a wonderful poetic composition by Maya Angelou. So the writer is of the African descent, and she is the one who has had the first-hand experience of being exposed to racial trauma, multi-generational trauma, and historical trauma. And that's the reason why she is so close to experiencing, realizing, and talking about such experiences. And this particular poetic composition, in fact, gives us a wonderful insight into the world of how a person of color or a black person feels about the historical oppression, the historical subjugation or exclusion that one has gone through. And this is exactly where you'll also get to see how epigenetic traits play a very, very important role. So let's take a look at this particular poetic composition. So when we start with this, now it starts with a sense of affirmation. The affirmation is that despite everything, I will rise. So the title of this poetic composition is Still I Rise. That means despite everything else, I rise. Come what may, I rise. So this is a wonderful, wonderful thing, because there is an emphasis on the idea of rising, not falling, despite being pushed to the fringes, the margins, despite being neglected, ignored historically, despite all sorts of oppressions. this speaker wants to or has decided to rise, and that's exactly what is at the core of this particular poetic composition. So the very first line in fact directs our attention towards the presence of historical trauma. So you may write me down in history. So we are a community, we are a group that has been written down in history, that has been historically oppressed, neglected, and written down. So that's a reality, and there is no harm in accepting the reality that this community has been historically neglected and excluded, written down. And the speaker does exactly that. It says that you have written us down in history. So that's an instance of historical trauma, the very realization of historical or multi-generational trauma. And how has that happened? With bitter lies and twisted truths, that has happened. And then that has also happened when people who are privileged have pushed or trod these people of color in the very dirt. But despite all these things, the speaker decides that he or she will rise. So as we walk along with the speaker, we also feel like, yes, whenever there are problems that shake our mental well-being, we can also think of rising. So we are gradually into the throw of the coping skills. So rising is a huge positive imagery that the speaker creates. So that's a coping skill. So thinking about something that will help you rise. So that's exactly what the speaker does in the very first segment. And then the speaker tries to play down the perpetrators of that historical or multi-generational trauma or racial trauma. So we can use them alternately: racial trauma, intergenerational, multi-generational trauma, or even historical trauma. So does my sassiness upset you? Why are you so upset? Now that's a classic example of downsizing or downplaying. You're downplaying your enemy, the perpetrator of your trauma. So you begin by downplaying and downsizing. If you remember, while discussing Death Be Not Proud, I hinted at this particular coping strategy, that is downsizing. So until and unless you downsize your enemy, it will be very difficult for you to manage the onslaught that has been launched by that enemy. So the speaker does that here as well. Why are you so upset? Why are you so beset with gloom? Why are you so sad, melancholic, so beset with gloom? Is it because I have this particular thing? Are you jealous of my possessions? Are you jealous of the things that I have? Why are you so upset? Why are you so sad? So by questioning the perpetrator, the speaker is in fact trying to downplay the power or the impact of the perpetrator. So unless that happens, the speaker will not begin to feel powerful or empowered. So this is one empowerment strategy that the speaker uses here in order to make oneself feel powerful, in order to feel that it's possible. The speaker uses this particular coping strategy. Let's move to the next segment. Just like the moons, like the suns, with the certainty of tides, all these things, they rise. So they never get stuck at one particular condition. So the moon rises, the sun rises, the tides also rise. Similarly, the speaker also decides that I would also rise. So by creating these wonderful analogies, natural analogies, the speaker in fact wants to make it a natural process, that rising is in my nature. You might have made me fall, you might have pushed me to the dirt, but rising is very much in my nature. If falling is in my nature, similarly rising is also in my nature. So I'll rise. So that's exactly what the speaker says here. And then a set of questions, like the previous pattern. Again a set of questions to downplay or downsize. Did you want to see me broken so that you can feel powerful? But that's not happening. With bowed head and lowered eyes, did you paint my picture in this way? But that's not happening. My eyes are not lowered. My head is not bowed. My shoulder is not drooped. That's not the kind of picture I'll present before you so that you can paint me in that manner. I'll not give you that opportunity. So the falling shoulders will not be visible to you. So are you also weakened by my soulful cries? Do you also want me to cry? That's not happening. So this series of questions in fact try to downplay the power of the perpetrator. I'm not broken, my shoulders are not down or falling down like teardrops. My head is not bowed, my eyes are not lowered, and I am not giving any soulful cries. I'm not crying, I'm not sobbing. If these things do not happen, what will the perpetrator do? The perpetrator will feel powerless, because the perpetrator has been feeling powerful only when, or because the perpetrated, the victims have been showing these symptoms, these signs. And that's the reason why the perpetrator has been feeling powerful. But the speaker here decides that I'll not allow the perpetrator to continue to feel powerful. I'll downplay, I'll downsize. And then we come to the next segment. Again, a set of questions. Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard because I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard? Do you not like it that I laugh? I can also be happy. I deserve to be happy. Does my haughtiness offend you? Do you feel offended? Therefore, this aggression. So there is no need for you to feel offended. Then we'll go to the questions first. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? So what exactly are you upset with? So the speaker proves that the perpetrator is upset with something. The perpetrator would not like this to happen. If this happens, the perpetrator will be upset. And this is a coping strategy adopted by the speaker here. The coping strategy is to keep the perpetrator upset or in a state of upset, so that the feeling of power will gradually vanish, disappear, and the speaker will gradually become empowered. So that's exactly what the speaker does. And then you may shoot me with your words. That's exactly how psychological trauma also happens. We don't have to shoot somebody actually, physically. We can shoot somebody mentally through or with the help of words, and we can devastate that person. You may cut me with your eyes, the kind of gaze that these privileged people have given to the underprivileged and the unprivileged ones, the oppressed class and communities. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise. So rising again sets in. So the speaker doesn't allow himself or herself to be separated from that particular image of rising. So rising is everywhere. It gets repeated every time the speaker thinks about those strategies which were employed by the oppressors to fix the oppressed. All those strategies like shooting with words, hating or killing with hatefulness, or cutting people with their eyes, the gaze. And then we come to the final segment of this poem. When she says, or when the speaker says, out of the huts of history's shame, we've been historically shamed. That means we've been historically excluded. So she is again pointing towards historical trauma. There's historical trauma which has caused a lot of suffering, pain to multiple generations, and that has been going on for generations altogether. Out of the huts of history's shame, we have had a very small history, and a minimized, ignoble history. Therefore, the hut image. The huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. The past, again, this multi-generational trauma or historical trauma, racial trauma. And then I am this, I am that, the acceptance, the reclaiming. So this reclaiming plays an extremely important role here, because that's a very important coping skill. You reclaim that. So I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide, leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. So then there's a series of I rise that we come across as we move on, and it ends with 3 times I rise, a repetition. So, but before that, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, and I'm the dream and the hope of the slave. Now this is a wonderful pointing towards the future. Time perspective, future. I cannot change what has happened. I cannot change what is happening, but I can surely change what will happen. So how can I change that? I can change that with these particular strategies, so that I am not taken a victim, I am not captured, I am not trapped in that vicious cycle of racial trauma or historical trauma or multi-generational trauma. And that's how the speaker in fact pronounces that I rise, I rise, I rise. So I'll take you to the coping skills and strategies that are employed in this particular poetic composition. The first most important coping skill that is employed here is that of healing sentences or healing words. We all know that words are extremely powerful. So when we use words in a certain manner, they in fact get glued to our mindset, our psychological setup. So if somebody says, I'm going to fall, I'm going to fall, I'm going to fall, the person will fall, of course. If somebody says, I'm going to rise, I'm going to rise, I'm going to succeed, the person will succeed and rise. So that's the power of words, or the healing power of sentences or words. That's exactly what the speaker uses here, employs here, that particular skill. So that's an instance of unconscious relieving. So this unconscious relieving can go on for generations. That means the speaker or persons can relive the same kind of traumatic experiences in time to come. So therefore it's very, very important that those traumatic experiences are not relived. So when that happens, when people recognize that they have been carrying thoughts, emotions, feelings and behaviors, or even symptoms that do not originate with them, that originated elsewhere, with some somebody else. So that's the reason why we need to get rid of this reliving experience of racial trauma, and that's exactly what the speaker does here through the use of healing sentences. There are sentences that heal you, that do not kill you. There are so many expressions, like suns, like moons, like air, like dust, so many healing sentences. I will rise, I will rise. Those are healing sentences. If somebody has broken a limb, somebody has got a fracture or fractured leg, the person has to say, the person has to use healing sentences or healing expressions so that one can quickly recover. So the power of healing expressions or healing sentences is known, is well known, and that's exactly what the speaker does here. And then there is something else that the speaker also employs, that is community healing. Apart from using healing expressions or healing sentences, the speaker also uses community healing or explores the power of community healing. And how does she do that? If you remember when she talks about her ancestors, the gift of the ancestors. The trauma may be the gift, but we generally do not call a painful object or painful thing a gift. So she's also talking about the positive, the adaptive aspects of that particular painful experience. Because the trauma tells you that you need to adapt to the challenges it poses to you. Therefore, she calls it a gift of the ancestors. And the dream, the hope of the slave. So she or he, the speaker, tries to reconnect to the vibrant strengths of the ancestry and culture. Therefore, the speaker says, I'm a black ocean, the culture. The speaker tries to find strength in the culture. That's community healing. So this helps people process their grief and past traumas. They also create a new historical narrative which can have healing effects for those experiencing historical trauma. This is exactly what happens in the poetic composition. So community healing is also being practiced. That brings us to the third idea, that is reclaiming. I have already told you that she reclaims, yes, I am a black. I have been traumatized, but that is not a permanent or a fixed feature of my existence. I have been traumatized, I have been oppressed, I have been made to suffer, but I will rise from this particular state. I'll rise and I'll leave this particular state behind me when I rise. So reclaiming is another coping skill that the person uses here. And then remembering and remembering. When it comes to historical trauma, remembering plays an important role. I have already told you that trauma is more about a forgetting problem than a remembering problem. So there is no problem with remembering, because remembering can also lead to remembering. So remembering has this potential to remember, that is reorganize or rejoin the otherwise disorganized or disjointed psychological state. So that's exactly what the speaker does here. By remembering how it has been a historical shame, how it has been a historical exclusion, how it has been an instance of being pushed to the dirt, and several other things. So by remembering, the speaker tries to remember the broken or the fragmented psychological states. So this is also a very important coping skill that we get across. Downsizing or downplaying is a very, very important coping skill that has been employed by the speaker here, because until and unless we downsize and downplay the importance, the power of the enemy, the perpetrator, we cannot do that. if somebody continues to believe that the perpetrator is still very, very powerful, the person will always be in a state of traumatized experiences or a traumatized state. Therefore, downplaying helps. And this is one of the most important coping skills that the speaker uses in this poetic composition, a repeated positive imagery. We all know the power of repetition. I think I can, I think I can. So positive thinking, I think I can, I think I can. So you can actually do that. So that's the power of positive thinking, positive repetition, which the speaker employs here quite convincingly, quite effectively. Repeated positive imagery. And what is that imagery? The imagery of rising, not falling. One is in a fallen state, yet the person believes that he or she will rise. And then finally, one final pronouncement that yes, I rise, I rise, I rise. So this rising imagery, which turns out to be a positive imagery, helps the speaker cope with this kind of trauma. So with that, we come to the end of this lecture. I hope it has helped you understand a very different type of trauma, that is racial or historical or multi-generational trauma, and you have been able to focus on the coping skills and strategies that the speaker in Still Arise uses in order to overcome the impact of that particular kind of trauma. So thank you very much for joining me.